Vincent the Shadow Marcelli operated in a world of whispers and silhouettes, a phantom whose reputation was built not on flamboyant violence, but on absolute silent negation. He didn't defeat alarm systems or guards, he made them irrelevant. In the cosmology of the East Coast underworld of the early 1960s, he represented a unique and modern form of power. While mob bosses built their authority on fear, loyalty, and territorial control, Marcelli's authority was born of impossibility. He was the man who proved that walls, locks, and the most sophisticated security money could buy were mere suggestions. His value wasn't in what he took, but in what he undermined, the very concept of safety, the illusion of privacy that even the most hardened criminals clung to in their deepest sanctuaries. When the Lucchese family, seeking to send a catastrophic message to their rival, Was Bumpy Johnson, concocted their plan, they didn't hire a squad of shooters. That was ordinary, expected, a language Bumpy was fluent in. Instead, they commissioned a poet of violation. The $40,000 fee, a king's ransom at the time, wasn't payment for a simple burglary. It was an investment in symbolic annihilation. The target wasn't Bumpy's warehouse, his policy banks, or his street corners. It was his bedroom. The objective wasn't theft or even direct assassination. It was the delivery of a message on his own pillow, perhaps while his wife, Mamie, slept beside him. The goal was to transform the one place where the myth of Bumpy Johnson melted away into the reality of a man at rest into a stage for his ultimate humiliation. For the Luccheses, this was strategic genius. To have Marcelli, the living legend of intrusion, slip past every layer of Bumpy's assumed security would do more damage than a dozen gangland hits. It would broadcast that Bumpy's power was a facade, that his intelligence network had failed, that his aura of invincibility was a joke. In the theater of gangsterdom, reputation is the currency that buys loyalty and commands fear. If Bumpy couldn't protect his own home, his own marriage bed, what protection could he possibly offer the soldiers and hustlers who depended on him? The break-in was designed to be a psychic bomb, shattering the core perception of his control. It would tell every soldier, every rival, and every cop on the pad that the godfather of Harlem was vulnerable, in a way that was almost intimate, profoundly disrespectful, and utterly terrifying. Marcelli, for his part, accepted the contract with the cool professionalism of a master craftsman. To him, Bumpy's brownstone was just another puzzle box, likely more intricate than most, but ultimately solvable. He would have studied its patterns, the comings and goings of aides, the shifts of any lookouts, the routines of the household. He would have noted the windows, the fire escapes, the architectural quirks of Harlem's storied buildings. His confidence was not arrogance. It was the earned certainty of a man who had never met a lock he couldn't persuade, or a shadow he couldn't become. The legend of Bumpy Johnson, a legend built on decades of ruthless survival, from the war with Dutch Schultz to his reign over the neighborhood, was just another piece of background noise. Marcelli dealt in physical realities, not stories. He was the antithesis of myth. He was the man who proved myths were penetrable. This set the stage for a collision not just of two men, but of two diametrically opposed concepts of power. On one side was Marcelli's power of negation, of invisibility, of proving that any barrier could be rendered meaningless by sheer technical skill and audacious calm. His was the power of the modern, the clinical, the impersonal. He was a specialist in a world of brutal generalists. On the other side was Bumpy Johnson's power, which was ancient, personal, and woven into the very soul of Harlem. It wasn't just about money or guns, it was about respect, intelligence, and a psychological depth that few of his contemporaries could match. Bumpy understood that true power wasn't just about responding to threats, but about understanding the theater in which they were presented. He didn't just live in his home, he imbued it with his presence. It wasn't a fortress to be defended from the outside, it was the inner chamber of his kingdom, a space where his own rules of reality held sway. The Luccheses and Marcelli fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the territory they were invading. They saw a physical location, a target to be compromised. Bumpy understood it as an extension of his own mind. So while they planned to break in, Bumpy prepared a reception. The bed where Mamie slept was not a symbol of vulnerability to be exploited. It was the sacred, inviolable center of his world, the ultimate lure. By focusing their entire symbolic assault on penetrating that room, the Luccheses inadvertently defined the exact terms of their own defeat. They weren't sending a master thief into a house. They were sending a message into a mind that was already waiting to receive it, rewrite it, and send it back with devastating, unforgettable clarity. Marcelli, the man who specialized in proving things were not as secure as they seemed, was about to walk into a trap that existed precisely because Bumpy Johnson knew that some illusions, like the illusion of a sleeping king, are the most dangerous ones of all. The stillness of a sleeping household holds its own particular language. The soft rhythm of breath from the next pillow, the distant groan of old plumbing, the sigh of a settling floorboard. These are the sounds of a world at rest, of vulnerability accepted, of peace. For Mamie Johnson, lying beside her husband on the night of March 15, 1962, that peace was a hard-won treasure, bought with decades of her husband's perilous navigation through the underworld. Her sleep was an act of profound trust, a belief that the legend of Was Bumpy Johnson was a blanket thick enough to keep the cold of Harlem streets at bay. It was a testament to the persona he had built so completely that it could convince even his own wife, in their most private sanctuary, that they were safe. But Bumpy was not sleeping. He was engaged in a different kind of communication entirely, listening to a different set of frequencies. While Mamie heard the comfortable silence of home, Bumpy was listening for the discordant note, the off-tempo click, the breath that did not belong. He was not a man reacting, he was a man waiting. And in that distinction lies the entire terrifying pivot of the night. To understand the depth of this calculated wait, one must first dismiss the idea of it as mere precaution. This was not a king nervously double-checking his castle gates. This was the hunter, having studied the patterns of a particularly clever predator, deciding not to patrol the perimeter, but to wait at the exact point of the anticipated kill. The intelligence that flowed through Bumpy Johnson was the most valuable currency in his empire. It was a web spun from decades of alliances, paid informants, strategic friendships with doormen, cops, waiters, and rival crew members on the outs with their own bosses. The Lucchese family's plot, for all its secrecy and the ghostly reputation of its instrument, was not born in a vacuum. $40,000 contracts have a weight. They displace air. They create whispers. Bumpy would have known a price had been set. He would have known the nature of the intended message. He may have even known the specific artist they intended to hire. In the world of organized crime, true secrets are rare, and Bumpy Johnson was one of its most attentive librarians. So, he did not barricade the doors or post extra men. That would have been an admission that the enemy's plan had merit, that a physical defense was necessary. Instead, he did something far more psychologically potent. He turned his home from a target into a tableau. He allowed the narrative of his vulnerability, the sleeping wife, the unguarded home, the arrogant king in his bed, to persist, even to deepen. He became an active participant in the story his enemy A's were telling themselves, but he was writing a different ending in invisible ink. By choosing to wait in the dark, he transformed the home invasion from a violation he would suffer into a performance, for which he was the sole director and intended audience of one, Vincent Marcelli. This waiting was an act of supreme confidence and controlled fury. It required a stillness deeper than sleep, a patience that is the absolute antithesis of panic. Imagine the scene, the darkness of the bedroom, punctuated only by the streetlight's faint glow through the curtains. Mamie's steady breathing beside him, the slow crawl of time. Every minute that passed was a minute Marcelli was moving through the outer rooms, a silent shadow meeting the waiting shadow. Bumpy would have been perfectly still, not a creak of leather, not a rustle of silk. He was practicing a form of ambush predation that feels ancient, almost primordial. He was allowing the threat to come to him, to fully commit, to believe completely in its own success. He was not just defending a space, he was setting a trap in the most intimate chamber of his world, using the enemy's own plan, their desire to humiliate him in his place of rest, as the bait and the spring. There is a profound power in letting an opponent fully deploy their strategy. It is the martial arts principle of using the enemy's force against them, applied to psychological warfare. By the time Marcelli's hand touched the bedroom doorknob, he had already lost. He had moved from being the shadow, an unstoppable external force, to being a player who had walked onto a stage meticulously set by another. His legendary skill and entry became, in that moment, not his triumph, but his trap. He was no longer the agent of a message, he was its delivery boy, carrying the Lucchese family's disrespect directly into the hands of the one man most equipped to answer it. When the door finally opened, and the silhouette of the best break-in artist on the East Coast framed itself against the dim hallway, the dynamic of the entire night shattered and reformed in an instant. The predator-prey relationship was inverted not with a shout, but with a voice from the darkness. Bumpy's first words, a calm, knowing utterance, were the culmination of that long, deliberate wait. They were the detonation of the psychological mine he had laid. In that second, Marcelli's entire reality collapsed. He was not a ghost. He had been seen, anticipated, and cataloged from the moment he picked the first lock. His invisibility was a gift that had just been revoked. His skill was rendered meaningless. He was no longer a legendary operator, he was simply a man in a room with Bumpy Johnson, who had been waiting for him. The violence that followed, however severe, was almost an afterthought, the brutal period at the end of a perfectly constructed sentence. The real lesson, the trauma that would haunt Marcelli and echo through the underworld, was delivered in the moments before a single blow was struck. It was the lesson that Bumpy Johnson's domain was not defined by locks and walls, but by his own perception and will, that he could be sitting there in the dark, waiting, turned his home from a physical location into a state of mind that saw everything, expected everything, and was prepared to meet any challenge, not with frantic defense, but with chilling, premeditated consequence. The weight was the weapon. Everything else was just the inevitable bloody result of its trigger being pulled. The moment Vincent Marcelli crossed the threshold of that bedroom, he ceased to be a master craftsman and became raw material. Bumpy Johnson did not see an assassin or a thief. He saw a vessel, an empty page upon which a new and terrifying story could be inscribed. What happened next was not a crime of passion or a frenzied act of defense. It was a deliberate, almost pedagogical exercise in the art of underworld communication. Bumpy understood that simply removing the threat, a silent body in a vacant lot, would only create a mystery. Mysteries invite speculation, challenge, and repeat attempts. Instead, he needed to create a lesson so visceral, so perfectly calibrated, that it would circulate on its own power, becoming a self-perpetuating myth. He needed to allow Marcelli to survive, but to return him to the world fundamentally altered, a living testament written in scars and shattered nerve. The violence, therefore, was never random or gratuitous in its intent, it was narrative. Each action was a sentence, each wound a punctuation mark. The goal was not to kill the man, but to kill the legend of the shadow, and replace it with a new, cautionary tale. Bumpy was operating with the mindset of a playwright and a surgeon, combining psychological terror with physical precision. He had to dismantle Marcelli's entire sense of self, the cool professionalism, the invulnerable stealth, the detached arrogance of the specialist, and rebuild him as a walking monument to Bumpy's own omnipotence. The message had to be carved into the messenger's very being, ensuring he could never again be a neutral tool. He would be a possessed object, forever broadcasting the consequences of crossing that particular line. Consider the setting, the sanctity of the bedroom, with Mamie possibly still sleeping or silently witnessing from the bed. This was not a back alley or a warehouse basement. This was the innermost chamber, a place of ultimate personal power. By staging the lesson here, BP ensured the violation was answered precisely where it was delivered, amplifying the symbolic weight 100-fold. He turned the Lucchese family's chosen theater of humiliation into his own stage for a demonstration of absolute dominance. The room itself became a character in the story, a silent witness that would henceforth carry the energy of the event. Every future guest, every associate, would feel the echo of that night, though the blood would be long washed away. The interrogation, if one could call it that, was likely the first act, but it wasn't merely about extracting names. Bumpy surely already knew who had sent him. It was about the process, the reduction. It was about forcing the ghost to speak, to beg, to confirm details aloud. To hear the once invincible shadow's voice crack with fear in that dark room was to destroy his utility. A tool that feels fear is a compromised tool. Bumpy was not just gathering information, he was applying the first layer of the new narrative, establishing a revised hierarchy in the most intimate way possible. He was making Marcelli an active participant in his own dismantling, forcing him to vocalize the failure of his mission and the strength of the man who had thwarted it. Then came the craftsmanship of the consequence. This was not a beating born of rage, it was a calculated application of terror. The injuries inflicted would have been chosen for their lasting impact, both physical and psychological. A broken hand for the lockpick, damaged knees for the cat burglar's grace, a facial scar that would forever mark him as a man who had been seen, known, and corrected. The pain was secondary to the permanence. Each lasting mark was a brand, a seal that communicated ownership. Marcelli would look in the mirror every morning for the rest of his life and see not his own face but Bumpy Johnson's signature. He would feel a twinge in his joints with every change in weather and be reminded of the price of that $40,000 contract. The violence was engineered to be carried, a lifelong sentence, but the true masterstroke was the release. Letting Mars go was the final, crucial chapter in the composition. A body is a closed book. A living, broken man is a circulating library. Bumpy understood that Marcelli's return to the world was the dissemination of the story. He would not need to call a meeting or send a note. The evidence would shamble back into the social clubs, bars, and shadowy corners of the Lucchese family's orbit. The sight of the broken artist, the sound of his story told in a hollow voice, the unshakable fear in his eyes, these were more powerful than any second-hand account. It was testimonial proof. Marcelli became an unwilling, lifelong evangelist for Bumpy's doctrine of consequence. The message was multifaceted and crystalline in its clarity. To the Lucchese family it said, "Your best instrument is now my loudest speaker. Your plot has been turned inside out, and now proclaims my strength, not my weakness. You paid $40,000 to make me a legend." To the wider underworld, it established an immutable law: the street is the chessboard. My home is not a square on it, it is the hand that moves the pieces. It drew a boundary not just around a building, but around Bumpy's personal life, his marriage, his private self, declaring them utterly off-limits under pain of a fate worse than death, a death of the soul, followed by a life as a cautionary tale. In the end, the brutal lesson was a supreme act of artistic terror. Bumpy Johnson took the raw elements of a professional insult, the intruder, the cunt, racked the intended message, and alchemized them into the opposite. He didn't just stop a break-in, he authored a folk tale. He transformed Vincent the Shadow, Marcelli, from a specter of fear into a concrete, tangible proof of what happens when one mistakes the king's quiet for slumber. The story that flowed from that bedroom on March 15, 1962, carried a weight that heavier weapons could never achieve. It created a silence around his home that was louder than any alarm, a respect born of a deeply understood, meticulously illustrated fear. In the violent, transactional world of organized crime, where territories were constantly negotiated and allegiances shifted with the wind, power was a fragile construct. It was built on a volatile compound of fear, profit, and a carefully curated reputation for ruthlessness. You could lose a shipment, a street corner, even a soldier, and still remain in the game. These were the expected losses of a brutal commerce. But for a figure like Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, whose legend was woven from something older and more profound than mere racketeering, there existed a line that was not just a boundary, but the very foundation of his being. This line was drawn around his home, and within it, the person of his wife, May. The events of March 15, 1962, were not merely a defense against an intruder, they were a catastrophic public defense of the sanctity of his legacy, a legacy for which his marriage and his private domain were the sacred, inviolable core. To understand why this incursion demanded such an apocalyptic response, one must look beyond the ledger books of Harlem's numbers games and understand the unique nature of Bumpy Johnson's authority. He was not just a mob boss. He was a patriarch, a folk hero, and a custodian of a certain dignity in a world that actively worked to strip it from black men. His power was personal, charismatically earned, and deeply intertwined with his identity as a man of intelligence, taste, and control in a society that offered him little of any. His home was not merely a residence, it was the physical manifestation of this hard-won personhood. It was where the performance of Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem, could recede, and Ellsworth could simply be. It housed his library, his art, his quiet conversations with Mamie. It was his sanctuary from the chaos he managed. To violate that space was to do more than threaten his safety. It was to deny him his humanity, to reduce him to just another target in a jungle. It was an attack on the very idea that he had carved out a realm of order and respect. And at the center of this sanctuary was Mamie. Their relationship was a cornerstone of his legend, and, by all accounts, his personal stability. She was not a trophy wife hidden away, she was a partner, a confidant, his anchor to a world that had moral weight. She represented the civilian life, the normalcy, the love that existed outside the calculus of violence and betrayal. For the Lucchese family to send a man into their bedroom while she slept was an act of desecration that touched on something primal. It weaponized his love for her, attempting to transform his deepest source of strength into his most acute vulnerability. It was a move of breathtaking cynicism, suggesting that the bonds he held sacred were merely liabilities to be exploited. This wasn't a challenge to his business, it was a challenge to his soul. Therefore, Bumpy's response could not be proportional. It could not be a simple tit-for-tat arson or a retaliatory hit on a Lucchese captain. A business dispute could be settled with business-like violence. This was different. This was sacrilege. The reaction had to be so disproportionately fierce, so creatively terrifying, that it would redefine the moral architecture of the underworld. It had to establish a new, absolute law, that while the streets were a free-fire zone of ambition, the threshold of his home was the border of a different kingdom entirely. By defending that threshold with such unforgettable severity, he was defending the integrity of his entire constructed self. He was stating, in blood and bone, that his legacy was not comprised of the money he made or the streets he controlled, but of the respect he commanded for the life he had built against impossible odds. The lesson he crafted for Vincent Marcelli was, in essence, a theological statement in the religion of respect. It was a sacrament of terror. Every calculated moment of that night, the waiting, the surgical violence, the theatrical release of the broken messenger, was a verse in a new commandment. The message was clear. You may contest my empire, but you will not invade my temple. You may plot against the gangster, but you will not terrorize the man. The woman beside me is not a pawn in your game. She is the queen on my board, and her safety is the condition for yours. This was about erecting a barrier so psychologically impregnable that the very thought of crossing it would cause a seasoned professional like Marcelli to freeze in future contemplation. In the aftermath, the sanctity of that space was forever cemented. The story did what no arsenal of weapons could achieve. It created a force field of narrative. The home at 179 West 115th Street was no longer just a brownstone. It was a shrine to a lesson learned. Associates who visited would feel the weight of the story in the air. Rival bosses, when contemplating moves against Bumpy, would now have to factor in not just his street soldiers, but the mythical, personal vengeance that awaited any intrusion into his private world. The legacy he protected was multifaceted. It was his love for Mamie, his right to privacy, his intellectual self that prized books over bravado, and his standing as a man whose word and whose walls were equally unbreachable. Ultimately, the defense of his home that night was the defense of the idea that even a man who lived by the sword had a hearth that was sacred. In a life steeped in moral compromise, it declared that some things were not for sale, not up for negotiation, and beyond the reach of underworld commerce. By drawing that line in the most indelible ink possible, the shattered psyche of the East Coast's best thief, Bumpy Johnson did more than secure his property. He secured the meaning of his entire tumultuous life. He established that his legacy would not be one of unchecked predation, but of a fierce, terrifying protection of the small, civilized world he had built for himself and the woman he loved. In defending that bedroom, he was fighting for the right to have something real, something soft, something human to come home to after a lifetime in the hard, cold dark. And he made sure everyone, for generations, understood the price of threatening it. In the cacophonous ecosystem of organized crime, where power was asserted through headlines of gangland slayings, brazen daylight hits, and the constant, whispered threats in social clubs, the most powerful statement often resided not in a sound, but in a silence. The aftermath of the events in Bumpy Johnson's bedroom on March 15, 1962, created a profound and enduring quiet, a void where challenge and intrusion should have been. This silence became the true monument to that night's violence, a perpetual, echoing absence that spoke louder than any gunshot or shouted warning. It proved that the ultimate deterrent in a world governed by fear is not merely a corpse, but a perfectly crafted story. A narrative so psychologically complete that it renders action unthinkable, turning every potential future intruder into the protagonist of a tragedy they are desperate to avoid. The immediate result was stark in its simplicity. No one ever tried again. Not the Lucchese family, who had commissioned the original insult. Not any upstart crew looking to make a name. Not any rival seeking an advantage. The brownstone on West 115th Street became in effect an island of absolute taboo in the bustling sea of Harlem's underworld intrigue. This was unprecedented. In a business where no slight was forgotten and revenge was a cyclical currency, the total cessation of attempts was a statistical anomaly that defied the volatile nature of the life. It signaled that a fundamental law of physics had been rewritten. The home had been removed from the battlefield, not by fortification, but by mythology. The story of Vincent Marcelli's transformation from the shadow into a shattered walking lesson had done the impossible. It had created consensus. It established a universally acknowledged truth so potent that it required no enforcement. This echo of a silent rule worked because Bumpy Johnson understood the economy of underworld communication better than any of his contemporaries. He knew that a dead man tells no tales, or rather, he tells only one, that he is dead, a mystery. But a broken man, one allowed to walk away, becomes a living archive. Marcelli's very existence became a reference library for the consequences of that specific action. His scars were a public record. The tremor in his hands, the look in his eyes when certain topics arose, the way he would never again speak of locks or alarms, these were the chapters of the story. He became an embodied what-if. Every potential plotter, when imagining a similar breach, would be forced to see not an abstract risk, but the very concrete, degraded image of Vincent Marcelli. They would have to insert themselves into his narrative, to imagine their hands broken, their confidence stripped, their legend replaced with a punchline of terror. Bumpy had weaponized empathy, of the most fearful kind. The silence was also a product of the story's perfect closed-loop structure. There were no loose ends to tempt a revisionist. The story answered every question a potential challenger might have. Was Bumpy security lax? No, he was waiting. Was he caught off guard? No, he was the one in control. Was he merciful? No, he was creatively brutal. Could the intruder have fought back? No, he was psychologically dismantled before a blow was landed. Would killing the messenger have been wiser? No, his survival was the punishment and the propaganda. The narrative left no room for what if we did it differently. It presented the event not as a narrow escape or a fortunate ambush, but as an inevitable, predestined outcome for anyone who crossed that threshold. The lesson was total. It closed the book on the subject so definitively that to reopen it seemed not brave, but pathologically foolish. Furthermore, this silent rule amplified Bumpy's power in a subtle, pervasive way. It allowed his home to become a neutral ground of sorts, a place where even rivals could theoretically meet, because the absolute safety of that space was guaranteed by something greater than temporary truces. It was guaranteed by myth. This elevated his status from that of a powerful gangster to something closer to a sovereign. His domain was recognized. The silence around his home echoed outward, coloring all other interactions. If he could enforce such an absolute unwritten law with such psychological finality, what other unseen lines had he drawn? The fear became holistic, not situational. It made every negotiation, every street-level dispute, shadowed by the understanding that this was a man who thought in terms of legacy and symbolic truths, not just immediate gains. He operated on a different plane of strategy, one where actions were not just tactical moves, but statements etched in the collective memory. In the end, the loudest statement was the perpetual, unbroken quiet that stretched for the rest of Bumpy's life. That silence was the sound of a story doing its perfect work. It was the sound of a lesson so thoroughly learned that it no longer needed to be taught. The echo of that single night's violence became a permanent vibration in the foundation of Harlem's underworld, a low hum that reminded everyone of the cost of a particular kind of disrespect. Bumpy Johnson didn't just defend his home that night. He authored a social contract for the criminal world. He established that his private life was the one chapter in his story that was not open for editing, not subject to the usual wars of attribution and conquest. By allowing the story of Vincent Marcelli to be the only one of its kind, he made it the last. He achieved the pinnacle of deterrent power. He made the thought of the action more terrifying than the action itself. And in doing so, he built a wall made not of brick, but of shared imagination and dread, the most unbreachable barrier of all.